Okay, well, I'm sitting here on a rainy day feeling just a little bit low, just the way things are right now, but maybe that puts me in the right frame of mind to talk about slavery, because slavery makes me feel just a little bit low, and I'm sure if you were a slave, you'd feel a little bit low too. Um, I read a book one time, and it's weird, this was after I'd read, I don't know, a dozen books and articles on slavery. I just was obsessed with it during my graduate school period. And I read this book, and the opening line was just, it's weird how it just got me. It just said, imagine a world of masters and slaves. And you mean such a silly little sentence there, but then, I don't know, like it put me into the moment. Like, oh my God, I mean, I thought about slavery forever, of course. I thought about what it was like to be a slave, and but all of a sudden, the realization that that was real. I mean, it's like you think of it kind of in this, it's this historical thing, but imagine it really being the reality, that you're living in. And of course, I guess I'd want us all to be able to imagine that we were a slave. And what even seems strange would be imagine you're a master. Oh my God, that you own slaves, of course, in that situation. It's kind of a horrifying thought in many ways, but that it was this reality. It's not, it is something that's in our history books, of course, but it was this incredible reality that as Americans, as African Americans, of course, but as Americans generally, we have to somehow confront. We have to deal with. In 1860 or 1865, there were 3.9 million slaves that would become emancipated. But it just gives you the sense of this enormous group of people, of course, that had this extraordinarily problematic experience, which they had to figure out some kind of way to endure. I've thought about slavery in a million different ways, and just want you guys to know, it's just this really interesting, what we call the historiography of slavery. So this is how historians have looked at slavery. And, if you look at the very beginning of, well, just in the aftermath of slavery, of course, in the 19th century, heading into the early part of the 20th century, one of the strangest parts of the story is that our understanding of the slavery was controlled by Southerners. Southerners basically took over the history of Reconstruction, the history of slavery on their own. And so, of course, they created this image of slavery. It was the white South image of slavery, which was pretty much that slavery was not a good thing. They're going to at least say that it's good that it's gone, but that it wasn't such a horrible thing for those that had to endure it. And they perceived, of course, that there were benefits to slavery, to the individual slaves, that they had been uplifted from the barbarism of Africa, that they had been given Christianity and good work habits, that they lived in crude comfort, they were relatively happy. These were all kind of these notions that simply came from the Southern interpretation of slavery. And the thing that's so powerful is that those interpretations lasted well into the 20th century. And in fact, you can still find them in like high school textbooks as late as the 1950s. I do want you to know that, at some point, that people are going to turn against that perspective. And it had to do, in many ways, with World War II. It had to do with the extraordinary expressions of racism associated with World War II, the Nazis, the master race, of course, the Holocaust, the excesses of social Darwinism, all these things, had at least the positive impact of pushing most people away from racism and away from social Darwinism, kind of repudiated those notions, and people did back away in a very powerful very, very powerfully. And indeed, you get a whole new kind of interpretation of slavery that emerged, and this time, not the word of the South, but rather Northerners and others, that began to look into the situation. And their objective was relatively simple, and that was just that, where the Southerners had said that slavery was okay, they wanted to say that slavery was bad. Like that's going to be surprising to us. And they presented their evidence, of course. One individual historian presented the plantation as if it was like a concentration camp that had psychologically reduced the individual slaves. He actually argued that maybe the slaves did appear to be happy, but maybe that was because they were brainwashed and reduced to this situation where they turned into kind of Sambos, and others were just simply, focusing on just the violence of slavery, of course, the brutality of slavery. Those were the things that they wanted to present. And of course, it was a powerful and important corrective. But it had certain problems in that it just, in both cases, the Southerners were just looking at the slaves like, well, this is the way we perceive them, and then you have the Northerners looking at the slaves like they perceived them. Of course, all they really wanted to do was tell everyone that slavery was bad, and the Southerners were wrong about that. Then came another wave that really was interesting. This is when I was in graduate school, and this wave was sort of like trying to to look at these slaves themselves, to see them as actors in this drama, not just looking how the Northerners felt about it, or the Southern, but what about the slaves themselves? And the essential idea was to give them agency, to see them as actors who are creating, and Eugene Genovese was one of the great historians, he said, a world of their own, the world the slaves made. And it is there. There was a powerful kind of message here that they, in the general world of slavery, they created their own little world for themselves, in which they did their best to function in whatever way they possibly could. And the agency, and the agency kind of suggestions made it look. I mean, the intent was to kind of see the slave as a heroic player. These are heroic actors who are struggling against the oppression of slavery, doing the best they possibly can, creating a world of their own, of course, and doing some actually really interesting and creative kind of things. And that was a powerful kind of new perspective. But we're now kind of in a situation where we're trying to, there are historians who just want to see the slaves as people, as human beings, and to realize that, that they manifest the range of humanity. There were brave and courageous individual slaves, but there were cowards too, right? And there was love, but there was hatred, and then there was violence, and there was kindness, and the parameter, the gamut of human activities. Right? Slaves were not perfect people, any more than we are perfect people. They were like us, they had their foibles, they had their strengths, they had all those kind of things, and so they're trying to kind of come to a vision now, just really looking at sometimes even just the individuals, the slaves themselves, and trying to figure out. And it's still hard for me as a white liberal came of age in the latter part of the 20th century, not to kind of see the slave as the heroic individual fighting against, of course, the extraordinary oppression of slavery. But we should also just understand that they were human beings, and that they did everything that we, of course, in a very extraordinary situation, fighting in the best way they possibly can, sustaining, but still kind of representing the totality of the human experience in their own kind of way. I have to tell you that whenever I think about slavery, the thing that I always this is, I guess, this is me putting myself into the world of the slave, but figuring out how would you cope. Now we're in a moment of coping, right? And so maybe it's a little bit more effective kind of understanding. This isn't an easy time for you. I'm sure it's not an easy time for me and the people that are part of my family and the people that I love. And I can't see my daughters, and I can't see you guys. I can't, all these things that are kind of, and we do cope, But I think, whenever I think of slavery, I think that was the first thing that would come in. And I would think of, like, being the slave at the end of this long line of cotton, and they would drag these big bags behind them. They have like a big long sack. And cotton grows about waist high at the top. And so that often means that you are bending over trying to pick the cotton, all the cotton. And the cotton balls, when they pop open, they have this extraordinarily kind of, sharp little edge thing that kind of, they pull back, and those are kind of, cutting away at you. And you'd pick that cotton and you just put it in the bag, and you go down that long line. And it wasn't necessarily super hot at that time. This was often done in the fall. But then you get to and all you had to was another, you had to turn around and just do the same thing, and that's your life, and there's no wages you're working for, you're not working for the weekend, of course, and just, these day after day of this kind of tedium. And then you compound that, of course, with the extraordinary violence of slavery, routinely being whipped, even for minor infractions, or even just the threat of the whip that would be there. And then the excesses of violence that, people would be really hurt, and they could be killed, for various reasons. Those that were runaways, going to be whipped horribly. If they ran away too many times, they might have their foot chopped off. They might be castrated at some particular point. They did force those that were, seen as a problem, to wear metal collars around their necks and balls and chains that they would have to drag. And then, and people were killed. Slaves were killed routinely, of course. They could just be murdered by their master, and their master would get away with it because they could legitimize whatever their activity or whatever the reason was. And then there's just the daily sexual violence against women. And of course that's the issue. But even the men, the helplessness of the men, the emasculation of the men who can't necessarily protect them. But just rape was a daily occurrence, and if it wasn't rape, of course, the threat of the rape, and being there, of course, and just living in the world of tension and fear that they lived in, that they could be sold away, that they could be raped, that they could be whipped, and they were. All those things would happen to them. I guess what happens to me is I think, how could I survive that? How could I live in that particular world? And so, and this is from that historical era of agency. we have, and I think these things are still legitimate, though, in no uncertain terms, but we look at the coping mechanisms. We try to figure out, okay, what did the slaves do to sustain themselves in the face of all of this oppression, all of this violence, all of this tedium, this extraordinarily difficult existence. And we look at different things that the slaves did create for themselves, this world that they did create for themselves to kind of help them to get through it all. And one thing that was incredibly important was the family. The family is this vital component of the slave life. Now the families were at risk. One thing about slavery was that they didn't allow for marriage. No technical buy-ins in terms of slavery, because every slave was a capital asset and might perhaps be sold at any given time, and could be. And there are places, like Virginia was like the worst, where we think that about 80% of the people in Virginia, if you're born in Virginia, you're going to be separated from your family. This is something that would happen routinely. But the thing that was on their side was that the masters wanted there to be procreative units. They wanted to have a man and a woman together to create more slaves. And so in this, very economic advantage vision from the planters, the masters, they put men and women together into families. And of course, the slaves created a family for themselves, and they had children. They were husbands and wives, basically, in a sense at least of a common law marriage, and jumping over the land into the land of jumping over the broom, into the land of matrimony. They saw themselves as family, and they believed in families in the same way that all Southerners did. The families were critically important to them, and the family, was in many ways as strong as it could be, given the fact that they were subject to all kinds of problems, especially separation. And so, we see the family as a unit to try to sustain and help them cope as a coping mechanism. You can turn to your mother, to your father, to your brothers, to your sisters, and to help you kind of get through the difficulties of the day. We also see that the community became part of this kind of coping mechanism. So the plantation community, there was an argument of this thing called fictive kinship. So the idea was that every single person on the plantation was related to you, and that wasn't necessarily true, but you would perceive them as being related to you. So every adult man, was an uncle, and every adult female to you was an aunt, and everyone is kind of also, the children around you are your cousins, and you grew up together, and every adult in some ways had a responsibility to look after the children, to make sure things were okay, and they created this community of relative strength to sustain them through the daily difficulties. I mean, there's never going to be great times necessarily, but in the community, they would get together, and they did know how to have fun, and they had humor, and they were playful. They did these things that really do kind of sustain the morale of a group of people, even in the face of all kinds of difficulties. So the family, the extended community, of course. I swear the thing that I think would be the worst is if you were a slave, just one slave living with part of the middle class farmers, where they only could afford one slave, and you're stuck there just with the white people. That would be horrible. But to be part of the larger plantation, and the vast majority of slaves lived on these larger plantations, at least you would have the community there to kind of to help you. You'd be part of their community. You're going to help them. They're going to help you too. So that became something of a coping mechanism. There also was simply artistic creativity that became part of the coping mechanism. These were Africans who brought their culture with them, of course, and that culture will manifest. We actually see that there are sometimes slave quarters that were built early on that were reflections of African architectural types. They brought agricultural techniques, and in many ways we feel like the Africans introduced rice to the colonies much more. I mean, they're the ones who knew about rice and knew how to farm it, than necessarily the white people that were. They made baskets, and there's a little piece of road heading north out of Charleston where these African American women sit there making baskets out of the palm leaves or something like that, and they were beautiful. I had to tell you, I really wanted, when we pulled over, and of course, something like this was like $200. I'm like, oh, not sure I want to pop $200. I got a little couple teeny ones for $10 instead, but they were still beautiful. And African pottery styles that would manifest, or African American pottery styles that would manifest in America. And in their clothing, they often were only given the cast-offs, and they were given like a uniform of this Orson-bird cloth that they would make their tunics and stuff out. But whatever was left over, of course, would be from the white people, the hand-me-downs, if you will. They would take them, and of course, and sometimes appear in what you and I would think is a garishness, of color, explosion of color. But this was trying to fancy themselves and look good, and seeing themselves as kind of looking good and promoting as much color as they possibly could. So, just, through artistic expressions of various kinds, this was also kind of a sustaining grace to help them cope with just the daily awfulness as far as slavery is concerned. Another thing that was really important in slavery was an incredible oral tradition. In Africa, there was an amazing oral tradition of it's basically storytelling, but there's so much more to it. Storytelling, pantomime, musical components, congregational acts where you get everyone involved, and all of that comes over to America, no doubt about it, and it begins to endure within the slave population. And it often just meant that the slaves would have stories to tell, and stories that they would tell their children. And the stories were often, of course, with an intent to kind of teach the children to the care that you had to take, of course, especially around white people, the fact that you often had to disguise your true feelings, the fact that you often had to be very aware of the attitudes and behaviors of the white people, because that could be extraordinarily dangerous for you, and if they were in a bad mood or something like that, But these stories often were kind of telling them, how to behave, and there's a rich literature. It's an oral tradition, but it's really rich in terms of the African American community. There was this one kind of African American superstar. I think they called him Cap'n Jack. And Cap'n Jack was primarily famous for getting out of scrapes. He'd get himself into some kind of difficulty, and then he'd get out of it. And that's sort of a superpower as far as the slaves were concerned. And the stories often kind of were a little bit humorous, but there's this one time where Cap'n Jack is he's taking his master's wagon into town, and he gets arrested because he's perceived as being, that he wasn't, he didn't have a pass, he wasn't authorized to do that kind of thing. So he's sitting in the courtroom waiting for his trial, and there's cases before him that are being heard. And so, like, the first case is of a guy who's accused of stealing a cow. And he gets up, and the guy gets in front of the judge and says, no, master, I didn't steal that cow. I've known it since it was a calf, since it was born. And apparently that was enough to convince the judge, and he was let go. And then the next guy gets up, and he's accused of stealing a pig. And he says, oh, no, master, I've known that pig since it was a little piglet, since it was born. And apparently that was enough to convince the judge. And Cap'n Jack gets up there, and the judge says, here, you stole the wagon. And he said, no, master, I knew that wagon since it was a tree. So since it was original wood. And of course, this was enough to get him off too. So they would have their little stories that would present their own messages. The Uncle Remus tales, you may have heard of them before. They are from the African American slave community. They were recorded by a white guy, of course, and every time we have that kind of dynamic, we always wonder a little bit what's happening. But the Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Rabbit is the critical one, getting himself out of these scrapes as such, in the face of very problematic odds against much more powerful entities like bears and foxes. And, this is when Brer Rabbit can get out of that situation. That's kind of the idea that the slaves are trying to communicate to each other. Be smart, be quick, be clever, avoid the confrontation, avoid the problems that might be there for you because of your status as a slave. So, there's a number of things that the slaves did that would simply be there to, one big one that I almost forgot, religion. Religion was critical. Marx calls religion the opiate of the masses. So the way he would perceive that is that it is a drug that deludes you. It keeps you from thinking about the real world. And Marx would have seen religion as a device of the bourgeoisie, the dominant class, to kind of keep you under control, keep you thinking that it doesn't matter what you get in this world because you're going to get it in the next world, that kind of thing, and seeing it as a device a device of manipulation. Now you can flip that if you want, though, because Marx calls it the opiate of the masses, and sometimes the opiate is appropriate, so it could be medicine. And indeed, I think that the religion was medicine for the slaves, a very powerful medicine to help to sustain them, of course, through their difficult moment. By the time we get to the end of the antebellum period, the vast majority of Southern slaves are Christians. There are still some that would be maybe African traditional religions and some that would be Islamic, but they were in the minority, to say the least. The vast majority of them hadn't become Christians. They had become Protestants primarily, and I think I may have mentioned you already, primarily Baptists and Methodists, Southern Baptists and Southern Methodists. And they had their perspective on Christianity. Oftentimes they would be forced to go to the white folks' church and sit in the back or something like that, and they would hear the preacher, of course, tell them how St. Paul says, wives obey your master, or your husbands, and slaves obey your master. So the biblical perspective that says that slavery is legitimate and that you should be a good slave. But then, they'd be done with that, the white religious perspective, and they'd go on their own. And they would sometimes go what they called a Bresh Arbor. So Bresh Arbor was just, I don't know what. It's like a place in the woods or something like that. They would sometimes take and turn the kettle down. They thought that there was an acoustical quality to turning a kettle upside down that would absorb the sound because they're going to get loud, basically. And in that situation, in that moment, they would have their own religious expression. And it was a Christianity. It's Christianity, absolutely. But the Christianity, of course, where of the equality. Jesus says, "Let everyone come unto me." That kind of Christianity. The Christianity of the Hebrews, of course, being the good people, and the Pharaoh, the slave owners, being the bad, and those that are enslaved, of course, the good people. Those that are the enslavers are the bad people, and ultimately the Israelites are free. They get to go away from slavery, and this became, of course, an essential hope as far as the slaves were concerned. So they took the Christian religion, but they took the parts of it which they could really hold on to, and it would give them a sense of self, give them a sense of hope, give them a sense of ultimate salvation. So religion was critically important, kind of sustaining them through the difficulties of the slave existence. Now, the last thing, of course, that I wanted to share with you guys was that they also used music. And as you guys know, I have attempted to play guitar and sing for you guys throughout this interesting semester. I have to tell you that by taping and recording this and then seeing it, it's very humbling. It lets me know that I am not a very good guitarist or a very good singer necessarily. But guess what? That doesn't stop me. You guys are going to go, "Oh, too bad about that." But anyway, I'm going to sing to you anyway. Okay, sorry about that. So all through slavery, and I just realized I don't want to have this right this second. All through slavery, the slaves sang, and there would be those in the future who make this like racial, that black people are musical or something like that. Okay, well, that's not really what's going on here. Of course, there's lots of musical people all over the world. The Irish are very musical too. I think the real issue is not so much racial but cultural. The slaves were given very few avenues of expression, and whatever avenues they were given, of course, they were going to really develop those avenues. And one thing that they weren't stopped from doing was singing and making music. That was, I think the masters saw it as just a way that the slaves could get through the day in some ways. It was helpful to them and created, even to some degree, order to their work. Kind of a regularity of a rhythm to their work is a better way of saying this kind of thing, and got them through the long, tedious work days that they had to do. So. And even the white people recognized the extraordinary quality of slave music that began to develop, and there would be times, of course, where they would take advantage of it. They would have guests over at the plantation, and they would bring the slaves up to sing to them or something like that. And there's a lot of sort of recognition of that on the part of visitors, Northerners, and others who just simply were just amazed. And in many ways, what's happening here, of course, is the slaves are creating the foundation of what really is the greatest musical tradition in America, coming from the depths of the soul of African Americans. Starting out as the slave music, and then the multiple expressions that will follow after emancipation. Anyway, music was just something that just helped them to get through their day. They gave them a sense of dignity. They gave them a sense of identity. They gave them a sense of self-worth. And music is helpful. Last night they were doing the country music singers all from their living rooms and stuff like that, and the whole idea was that music kind of soothes the soul, and I think that's exactly right. It has that kind of impact. Anyway, they're going to use music to do a lot of things, so it became just part of life in many ways. And one part of it is to help them to get through the work day. Work days were long and tedious. They were repetitious. The endlessness of hoeing cotton or the endlessness of picking cotton, and thus, one way to make that seem less of a problem is to sing. And they're just sitting there, and all of them you can imagine. Whenever I think of the voices, I'm picturing kind of a tiredness to what they're doing, but still they're just singing along with each other. And the white people didn't say no. This is something they can do. No one's going to really do that. So a lot of the songs are kind of like chants almost, where one, you have a leader sort of person, and then those that will follow along. And in many ways, the whole concept was just to get everybody into the rhythm of the activity. And I have to tell you that a lot of our sources for these songs they come from slavery, but then they manifest in like the chain gangs that would be in the aftermath of emancipation, and making their all the way into the 20th century. And they finally got to the point where, there were individuals who were just interested in music and go record these guys, and they're working down there on the chain gang, doing their thing. And